name is Jeff Schloesser. I'm the Senior Vice President of Quad A, and it's a great privilege, just like last year, to be the facilitator for our first panel as we get started here in the Warfighter Theater this morning. What we have here is our international panel, and as I'm going to do some very quick introductions, and each of the panel members then is going to have a period of time in which they're going to talk a little bit about our topic, which has to do with how do you transition from 20 years of Allied fighting together in non-traditional areas, think Afghanistan and Iraq. Kosovo is a little bit more traditional. And how do you transition that over to the multi-domain operations that we know we have to now prepare for and be capable of not only deterring a peer competitor, but then fighting if the battle comes our way. And with us, we do have a pretty darn distinguished panel. Forgive me, I'm actually going to read some notes because of their extensive backgrounds. But first and not foremost, but first is Brigadier General Mike McCurry. He's the Deputy Commanding General of the 2nd Infantry Division in the Republic of Korea at this point. His previous assignments include commanding the 10th Combat Aviation Brigade, and as well as staff assignments, critical ones, as Chief of Aviation Force Development, as well as the Deputy Director of Army Aviation, Headquarters United States Army. He's got multiple combat tours. To his left then is Brigadier General John Novalis, former Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations, Multinational Corps Northeast, NATO, Poland, for all of you that haven't been tracking that recently. John's a previous commander of that great division, DCG, the 101st Airborne Division, as well as commander 1st Air Cavalry Brigade, multiple combat tours as well. To his left is Air Commodore Alastair Smith, head of capability for air maneuver at the Army Headquarters UK. Alastair's previous assignments include station commander RAF Shawberry as the group captain. Before that, command of 230 Squadron at RAF Benson. Deployments in Kenya and elsewhere, multiple exchange assignments with U.S. forces, including deployments to Iraq, and then deployment in Afghanistan as Deputy Commander for the NATO air mission there. To his left is Brigadier General Jean-Yves Bouillaud, Commanding General of the French Army Aviation Center of Excellence, obviously France. Previous assignments include Chief of Staff and Ops to the French Special Operations Command, Commander of 3rd Combat Helicopter Regiment, including deployments to Ivory Coast and Chad. J3 Air and Headquarters S4, Sarajevo, and command of an attack helicopter company deployed in the Balkans. Last but clearly not least is Brigadier General John Fenwick, Director General Aviation, Australian Army, Canberra. Previous assignments include Deputy Commander of the CJTF Land Component in Iraq, Chief of Staff, Special Operations Command, Command of 1st Aviation Regiment, multiple commands in Iraq and Afghanistan. Okay, so from the start, just from those introductions, what do you pick out of all that? You pick out that we've been fighting as an allied force now for, like I said, 2 decades. We've been doing it in areas that are essentially non-traditional. They were not where NATO thought they would be fighting, or any of our other forces that are allied with us as part of the multinational services that went into Iraq. And yet it was critical. We built a huge amount of capability, a lot of compatibility between how do you do air operations in an allied way, almost to the point where it's become fairly transparent. I won't say seamless. Everything is hard in the air because of friction, but we've made huge improvements. But now we are faced as an alliance within NATO, as elsewhere with all the rest of our allies. We're faced with a different program, or a different problem, excuse me. The challenge is a peer competitor. It may well be in Europe. It could be elsewhere, maybe in the Indo-Pacific theater, but we're going to have to think about how are we going to operate in an allied way in a multi-domain operation. So what I've asked our panel members to do is not only to reflect on their experience, but then to try to talk forward about how do they see us working closer together, more closely in certain areas, and just extrapolating into the future. And so with that, we're going to go ahead and start with General McCurry.
Thanks, sir, and thanks, Quad A, for putting on the panel. Looking back, I started probably my first experience with other services was during Desert Storm and in the 82nd, and partnered with the French 6th Armored Division in Desert Storm, and I remember plain as day as a lieutenant in the dust storms during the early part of Desert Storm, seeing the Gazelles flying nearly sideways in the wind and being amazed at the strength of our partners then. And I look forward and flash forward to times in Iraq from 2004 with building the initial ICDC up through 2007 and 8 with the Iraqi Army, and then culminating in New Dawn in 2011, where I was partnered with the 21st Recon Squadron there at Taji. And so now here I find myself today in the Republic of Korea as a part of the 68-year alliance with our ROC allies, and I think it's just led to a deeper cultural awareness and richer experience for me professionally. As I started looking at this forum, I found an article written by Kelly Greco, published in Parameters, called Fighting and Learning in the Great War, based on World War I experiences, and the author calls out 4 lessons of coalition warfare. It says professional contacts and relationships matter, that battlefield success depends on institutional machinery developed during peacetime, that coalition warfare promotes military adaptation and innovation, and that the unity of command during wartime is fostered through consultative leadership that's built upon those relationships I mentioned first. And you know, I also looked at Secretary Mattis, former Defense Secretary Mattis, told us to strengthen and evolve alliances and partnerships in his strategy. So as I look at that, what I'm doing today with the Republic of Korea Army, I think of a couple things, and professional contacts and relationships mattering. My current boss, Major General Scott McKean, commander of 2nd Infantry Division, you know, he was assigned twice in Korea previously, once as a captain and then as the XO to General Thurman when General Thurman was the USFK commander. And the contacts that he maintains from that time make it so much easier for us to train and operate there in the Republic of Korea. And the cultural understanding that he has about how our Republic of Korea allies think and operate just facilitates our combined training. And then you look at these institutional machineries, and I think of the Combined Forces Command and the Combined Ground Command there in Korea, and that machinery is in place, you know, during peacetime to facilitate should things not go well. And when we talk about adaptation and innovation, I think every time we look at interoperability between the forces, it drives us down this adaptation and innovation path. And a good example of that is communications, you know, communicating between a ROC helicopter and a U.S. helicopter and the different pieces of hardware or software required to make that happen. So I think as we look forward to multi-domain operations based on all that I just talked about, you can see the criticality of developing those relationships early. You can see that we have to focus on adaptation and innovation to broaden the force wider than our own. And I'm just proud to be a part of the Alliance on the Pen today. Thanks.
Thank you, sir. John.
My name is John Novalis, as Jeff mentioned. I just left my last assignment, which was the J3 operations for Multinational Corps. I was located in Poland. Spent 20 months there. So it's given me definitely a unique perspective as to the coalition, the alliance. There is absolutely no one out there that does not understand the fact that we will, if we fight anyone, especially a near-peer adversary, we have to do it as a team. And I'm looking at the team right here. You know, it's going to be every single person, just not NATO. So it's a partnership that we're going to have to align with. So I'll ask you basically 4 questions. And with these questions, I hope that once we get done with our introductions, we can get into some questions and answers. And that's always a lot more fun than just reading off a piece of paper here. So the things I think that my questions are we interoperable? You know, can we talk aircraft to aircraft, aircraft to ground? Are we capable of doing that? Do we have the same doctrine? You know, are we fighting the same way? And even if we don't, is our doctrine at least compatible enough that we can make a difference for each other? Or are we just separate entities out there? Training. You know, are we training enough? You know, of course, the United States Army, you know, we go out to different places. We're always training. We're trying to execute just like every other country. But when's the last time we brought multiple aircraft together in a range, you know, maybe in Israel, and do an operation and actually figure it out? Or go to Poland and do a combined arms maneuvering training together. Because if we know that we're going to fight like we train and we're not training like we're fighting, then there's going to be a problem there. Okay. The second thing is, do we know our adversaries well enough? You know, is our doctrine and equipment based off of our adversary? You know, for me in Poland, there is only one adversary from the aspect of the Baltic countries, Poland, Romania, countries that border Russia. That's their adversary. They know it. And they are building their capabilities to go against that adversary. There's multiple adversaries out there. Everyone has a different perspective. So are we training? Are we building our capabilities against that adversaries? We know there's gaps and opportunities out there both. I think, you know, we mentioned that this morning, listened to General Martin, he was talking about that. But, you know, some of those gaps are, you know, medevac, fires, common doctrine, communication packages, both voice and digital. And then lastly, I think for all of us, aviation challenges. You know, I think that especially over in Poland, not all the infrastructure is there in Europe to allow us to train effectively. Are we building the infrastructure that we need? And if we're not, are we training to actually operate without the infrastructure that we need? Hard site facilities, maintenance sheds, you know, all those things that would help us obviously execute operations. Okay, so I threw a couple things out there for you to ponder, and hopefully we can come back 360 here in a short fashion and get after those. Okay, I'll hand it off.
Thanks, John. My name's Al Smith. I'm head of capability for Army Aviation Manoeuvre back in the UK. It's 2 years since I've done a NATO appointment, but I think I'd echo some of Mac's points there, that essentially interoperability is a mindset, and I think you see that in some of the NATO partnership posters that are around the place. We tend to focus on the equipment, and exactly the point, you've got to have interoperable radios and comms and data links and ammunition, etc. But first and foremost, as a start point, I think it's about a mindset. And if I think back a couple of years to a NATO appointment in Kabul with 23 different operators there in the aviation sphere, some of them NATO, some of them contractors, some of them UN, some of them embassy, etc. It's absolutely about a common mindset, and that's the one thing I'd offer we have in common, is that as aviators, wherever we are, we tend to have the same priority set as we go forward. We've got the luxury in the UK of being a little bit smaller, and so we're naturally leaning towards combined arms operations. Jointery is something that we do right from the start, from training all the way through. And if I think back to a NATO appointment previous to 2 years ago in 2011 for operations over Libya, that was a watermark for us in terms of how we dealt with multi-domain operations. So in that sense, we were operating British Army attack helicopters from a Royal Navy carrier off the coast, penetrating inland with fast movers from the Royal Air Force and the rest of the coalition on top, prosecuting targets and coming back out again. And combined strike packages between the fast movers in the air, way above, and low-level attack helicopters with oblique angle advantage at the bottom. So in some ways, we've done an awful lot of combined action, what we now recognize as multi-domain operations already. I would offer as my closing point, I think, that what we probably don't do is learn and adopt the lessons and carry them forward. That was 2011. We're now 8 years further forward with a different force design point, as John has talked about. And I would offer that perhaps, although we've had some of that experience, we haven't really pulled that through into our doctrine, our TTPs, and our mindset as we go forward. But I'll happily explore any of that as we go forward in Q&A.
Thank you.
Yeah, you got slides.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep. And they know. Yep, just go ahead, and there are your slides. And you can.
So, ladies and gentlemen, good morning.
Just take that.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you get feedback.
Yeah. So, in my position of commander of the Army Aviation School, so I will share, I would say, the different statements made this morning. And I would like to thank you for providing us the opportunity to share our views on the possible aviation's contribution to multi-domain operations. Using the trick of the bluff bottom line up front, I would say that Army Aviation should play a key role in MDO thanks to its inherent agility and its ability to mass effects. My demonstration will be based on some doctrinal ideas and on examples of recent operations conducted by aviation units over the past 10 years. Next. The French aviation is a force of 300 aircraft, which has permanently been committed to operations since 1992. In 2019, 50% of our assets belong to the fourth generation fleet. This provides us with a real advantage in the current strategic context. These aviation assets operating in complex operation have to meet the following criteria. Next. So, endurance, our aircraft should be able to fly at least 3 hours without refueling. Survivability, thanks to different design features as well as some type of equipment. We should be equipped with a digitalized C-Cube-I even for the legacy fleet, as you can see on this slide, and supported by tailored and mobile logistical assets in order to enable true tactical and operational mobilities. Coming back, next slide, please. Coming back to digitalization, the new Army network Scorpion should give us a clear advantage on our opponents by enabling the Army to understand, decide, and act more quickly to seize windows of opportunity. Army aviators have to be and will be fully connected to this network to deliver the best effects to the ground force. Next slide. In addition, we should continue to develop our interoperability, and so I share your views with other components, NATO, partners across the globe, and Homeland Security forces in order to fulfill the nation's strategic commitments. Beyond these different relationships, the goal is to create synergy with all these key players. For example, all Army aviation crews are qualified and trained for flight operation on Navy ships. We have used these skills in operation on several occasions over the past 30 years. Next slide. In addition, we consider that we have to be used to flying and fighting in different types of environment to ensure a real readiness and effective execution of the different types of mission. Next slide. Now discussing doctrinal issues, I would be frank with you. NATO ATP 49 is a very good document, but we think that the best use of aviation units have to be based on a true aviation warfighting doctrine, especially when we deal with offensive operation in medium and high intensity conflicts in order to get the best benefits from aviation assets. Next. The basic aviation warfighting are put in a nutshell on this slide. We consider that aviation should be assigned a mission to develop a real maneuver and not a mere list of tactical tasks. We should continue to task organize our units with elements such as ranger units, EW, engineer, among other things, to be able to carry out the assigned mission in a demanding environment. And we also should be granted with decentralized authority to engage the enemy. In order to illustrate these ideas, you may be interested in 2 vignettes on recent aviation operation. Both cases show the possible role of aviation in MDO and the effects that can be achieved at the operational level. Next. So the first example is related to our campaign in Sahel in 2013. Responding to a request of the Malian authorities, the President of the Republic decided to deploy a force in the country in order to stop an attack launched by terrorist groups in the direction of the capital city, Bamako, which is also on the left side of this slide. The Chief of Defense Committed Troops, Conventional Forces, as well as Special Forces, already deployed in theater. In addition, a brigade and an aviation battalion were sent from home station. Over a period of 3 weeks, the aviation battalion conducted 3 raids to seize key terrain, as well as to search and destroy enemy terrorist groups. The key takeaways with regard to MDO are the following. First, aviation battalion was able to conduct 3 major operations in depth, thanks to an appropriate task organization, which included reinforcement from other battlefield operating systems, and light combat service support package tailored for this specific mission. Second, aviation provided, reaction time and maneuver space for the brigade. And thirdly, this could enable command mission over extended ranges and complex terrain. Next slide. Now turning on Libya, an Operation Unified Protector, like our British colleague said. I will say this, during this short NATO operation, aviation units play a key role at the operational level in the framework of a sea-based operation and in close coordination with other components. Through the execution of 36 raids, the aviation battalion was able to find and destroy 600 targets. This battle damage was presented the destruction of 2 brigades. Of course, Libyan armed forces were not a first-class enemy, but we consider that some elements of this operation can be useful in the context of possible commitments against A2AD systems. It's now high time to conclude. Next slide. I would say that through the implementation of dedicated doctrine and shared doctrine, through the integration within a digitalized C3I network, the establishment of a combined arms task organization at the lowest level, cooperation with other components, allies, and partners, we assess that Army aviation can play a key role within multi-domain operation, and this concludes my briefing. Thank you.
Good, thank you. Okay, over to you, John.
We'll see whether, yes, I got the microphone working. I was a little afraid I wouldn't be able to. I think the overarching theme for Australian Army aviation, in fact the Australian Army as a whole, is trying to do a lot with a little. I challenge you, Al, when you comment that you have a small force. I'll show you a small force. So we have to have economies and efficiencies across our force, and of course that applies to aviation. When I think about multi-domain operations, I would like to split up, I guess, the 2 key bits of that. One is the standard phase of competition, and the other being the high-end combat. I think when you look at the high-end combat piece of it, Al, you're quite right, we smaller forces get quite good at combined arms operations within ourselves, but having technical solutions to interoperability are quite difficult. In particular, when you are trying to gain a lot from your force and trying to give it many jobs, and you can't necessarily specialise, interoperability with allies can often become one of the first things to go when you're in an acquisition. And you find yourself finding other things to spend money on. So then what do you fall back on to keep that interoperability going? And I think it's the things that both John and Mac talked about before. They're about relationships, it's about training and doctrine, and about how understanding each other fight. I can recall a conversation with my Chief of Army in about 2012 when we were looking at putting our Tiger helicopters into Afghanistan. And he was absolutely dead set adamant that we would not put the Tigers into Afghanistan unless they had Blue Force tracking. And my argument to him was, well, that's just a control measure. We can find the control measures to put Tiger helicopters in, and we should be able to do it. And I recall the French were able to put their Tigers into Afghanistan by keeping them within a discrete AO, but it was a control measure and it was part of standard doctrine and the way that we conduct business. It was the way to overcome the absence of a technical solution. So I think we just need to continue to think about the high-end activity we will conduct in MDO as allies will continue for us to need to engage in relationships, training, doctrine, exchanges and the like. That fundamental of the human aspect won't go away. It's not all about technical solutions. The second part for me is in the competition space. So the ongoing competition that happens before high-end combat. There's no escaping the geography that we suffer in Australia and our distance from many of our allies and the size of our region. And we are constantly in international engagement and other activities to continue to understand what that environment is like, ensure we have the relationships upon which to build if we ever have to transition from just a standard competition. So I think that's a very important aspect to think about too. Finally, I'd just like to say that, again, along the theme of needing to do a lot with a little, much of what we do with our aviation force back home ends up being in the areas of humanitarian assistance, disaster recovery and the like. And we can't force structure for that. And yet it's such an important part of our business. Indeed, it's a very important part of our business in the international engagement area as well. We certainly try within our region to be the partner of choice when it comes to a number of nations within the South Pacific area. That requires us to be on hand, ready to help whenever we can in a vast range of environments, not just high-end combat. So again, it takes a huge requirement for us to understand what our aircraft can and can't do, and being able to acquire the aircraft that can give us a broader range of options. We can't necessarily have highly specialised pieces of equipment. Okay, thank you.
Okay, all right, and thanks, John. And so thanks to all the panelists. Now, usually what we do before we open up for questions is the facilitator starts some questions. But first of all, I know a lot of you are thinking about what each other spoke. So any alibis out there? I mean, anybody want to talk about something else that somebody else brought up before we get started? No? Okay, all good. All right. So what we're going to do is we probably don't have microphones wandering around, so I have a microphone here, and I will ask for Anita. Can you hand out this microphone for me? But while you're thinking, what came to my mind, and again, I classify as an old codger who I was telling the group here that in the 70s, oh, thank you, Nancy. You know, my first assignments, my dad was in the Army of Occupation in Germany in the 50s when I was a kid. And in the 70s, my first assignment was in Germany on the Fulda Gap. And it seems like we've come around quite a ways. But back in those days, in the 70s and 80s, and I dare say even some of my friends up here participated as younger officers in large-scale operations, whether they were training operations. In Germany and Europe, they called them Reforger. In Korea, I spent 2 years in Korea. They were the ultra-focus lens, large-scale training operations, NATO-oriented in Europe. In Korea was UN-oriented, unified, the United Nations forces there oriented. But they were large-scale. We took a long time to prepare for them. We pre-trained before we did the training. And it wasn't synthetic. I mean, I'm sure there was computer backbones to all this. I was oblivious to Lieutenant Schloesser out there doing it. But what we did do is we had troops in the field. We were in the field. We were working with our different allies. And it was lieutenants with lieutenants and things of that nature. And that has become less, it's very expensive. You don't see it very often these days because of maybe either political issues having to do maybe in the peninsula, or just because of the sheer cost of doing it in Europe. Plus, it's a different environment. I mean, nobody wants, I well remember knocking down the same building every time we rolled out of our motor pool. And I'm sure the farmer appreciated that we rebuilt his building about every 2 years, but it can be very expensive. And a lot of those things, the environmental damage done by large-scale vehicle movements and stuff like that can be expensive. Night operations in Europe is not very popular, loud helicopters and stuff like that. But we have a threat out there that's very different these days. And maybe I just throw that out there for some thought. I don't know if you guys have any reactions about, should we go back to large-scale exercises where you actually have troops working together in the field between our allies, between each other? You don't have to answer it unless you want to, but any thoughts along the line? You got one mic down there, John. Or here we go.
You saw me flick the mic there very
Yeah.
quickly. I think it's very important, and it's interesting for me. The last time I was here at Quad A was 20 years ago when I was a captain assistant S3 in the 2nd 17th Cav, and to have been away for that amount of time and now come back and hear these discussions is quite interesting. We will be seeking to put 4 Tiger helicopters at Morts this year as part of that exact effort, which is to see coalition forces working together in that high-end sort of training environment. And I was just chatting to, in fact, it was General McConville the other day about the potential of doing those sorts of things, bringing Australian aircraft over for JRTC and the like, and just seeing how we can integrate that without disrupting the training activity that you need to have.
Yeah, that's good. John?
Anybody have a question out there first? Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, over there,
So,
Steve.
if you don't mind, for the panel, but talking about interoperability and looking really at future vertical lift. I'm Steve Mathias with Bell. To put some context to it, obviously we're interested in future vertical lift. But could you give us some insights into what, at least on the international side, how you are looking at future vertical lift to ensure interoperability in the future, and then how perhaps you're engaging with the U.S. Army, who's really got lead, and then for the 2 U.S. generals who both have a lot of experience, kind of on this in the Pentagon and other places. How do you see that process going? So what are y'all doing currently for future vertical lift and to ensure interoperability, and then how do you integrate with the U.S. government perhaps on the future platforms? And then I'll go stand in the middle and help pass the mic.
Yeah, Alastair.
Steve, thanks for the question. I think, so from a UK point of view, we've got 2 things happening at once. We've got our legacy fleets, which are nearing the end of their life cycle, and so they need replacing come what may. 10 years ago, that would have been a relatively simple proposition because that's just about buying some more of the same but newer. But in parallel to that today, the force design point has shifted. So as Jeff pointed out, it's the near-peer competition. So we've got to understand whether or not more of the same is the right way to go, or whether we need a paradigm shift in our capabilities. If we do, FVL potentially offers that shift, both in terms of speed and in reach. And the work that our team need to get into in some detail is to understand the attributes that you need from the future. So we've traditionally thought about speed, payload, range, the sort of hard attributes of aircraft. It's becoming clearer to us that we need to broaden the lens a little bit and talk a little bit more in different terms, different attributes. So speed may or may not be decisive. Some operational analysis will tell us that. Reach as a byproduct of speed is an entirely different attribute that might well be the sort of thing that we need. So independent deployment, we were talking a little bit earlier about decoupling ourselves from strategic air transport, which can be a fragile commodity or an in-demand commodity. So if we can self-deploy over strategic range, then independently of the speed that we maneuver once we're in theater, then that's an attribute itself, which is very helpful. So I would characterize our planning as we're in the stages of understanding what attributes we need. We're trying to do more than just replace the fleets that are aging. And once we understand the attributes that we need, then it's in the weave. And I would offer that the weave between tomorrow's capability and what we have today is actually the really tough part to do. Whether that's FEL or a whole different range of platforms, transitioning the human capital from today into tomorrow, again, 10 years ago was relatively simple because we deployed a relatively small percentage of the force. The principal difference with the new force design point is it's en masse at scale, and we have to maintain a higher level of combat mass throughout the transition than we would have had to before. That in itself is quite a profound inclusion in your fleet planning, etc. So that's sort of where we sit in the UK.
Other comments about future vertical lift?
I'll just quick counter punch to Al's there before I hand over to Mike for a little his insight. But I think what the issue that's going to have to come is there's not that many countries out there that have the capacity and capability to absorb future vertical lift when you go and you see what it is that they want their aviation to do. So I think the United States, we've already decided future vertical lift is where we want to go, and here's the capabilities that we want from it, and these are the reasons why we want it. You go to another country, I'll just pick one out at random, maybe Romania. You know, do they have the capability and capacity? Do they want to spend that kind of money, redo their entire training base for their soldiers in order to meet that new capability that's even though there's no doubt they'll look at it and go, my God, that is a great asset. I would love to have that in our fleet. It's just, is it what we need? And every country obviously has their own perspective as to what is it that they need. And I think, you know, tomorrow, I have a panel tomorrow that I'll set in, and I'll probably, you know, maybe scratch that a little bit more. It's really up to the, you know, is future vertical lift too much capability for most of the countries that are out there? That's probably the question. Hand it over to you.
Yeah, can I just mention something? Can you know, what the dilemma you bring up, John, and Alastair, you hit upon it as well, is that if we're going to fight as an allied force, you have to have compatibility. And in the day where it really doesn't matter as long as you're flying 130 to 140 knots, even if extended range, and General Bouillaud really showed some extended range requirements there in Mali, as well as off ship there for Libya. But if you're not compatible, so take that thought. It doesn't matter if you're flying a Super Puma, a Chinook, or Black Hawk, or whatever, if you're all kind of making 140 knots and you have that same sort of endurance capability. If one of our allies changes that and it goes twice as fast and has twice the endurance and has the ability to strategically deploy to a tactical employment, that's a pretty hard thing to say for me, but I mean, the way it talked, I mean, but if you have those capabilities, it's going to put a dilemma to many of our allies about, well, if you want to be in the fight, you got to be there. I mean, you literally got to be able to be there. And that's going to be a dilemma, I think, over time as you see that. I mean, to industry, that means you're going to have to drive down the costs of ownership and maintenance and things of that nature if you're going to be able to widely disperse this, you know, to the point of whether, you know, whatever aircraft you pick, that's somewhat ubiquitous in the world among our allies. And but it's a dilemma. It's clearly something, John, that I mean you pointed out, and Alastair, I think is a challenge. General Bouillaud, did you want to make a comment about future vertical lift, or John? Yeah, please.
Jeff, when you're done, we have one more question.
Okay. Yep. Yeah, we'll just make that comment, and then we'll come on over there.
So our timelines for considering future vertical lift are much the same as the UK's. I think the other key bit for us, General, is that it's about supply chains and all the other bits as well. So you talk about compatibility. It's not just forces being able to work with each other, but it's being able to rely upon similar supply chains if we're in an allied environment. Weapon systems need to be either the same or compatible. And so it's that whole linkage of the logistic chain as well that needs to be considered. particularly if we start to look at air-launched effects and all the other things that are actually the enablers of what we're trying to do here.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Matt, did you want to say anything?
Yeah, with regard to, I think, capability development and delivery, I think, you know, the more we can consider what the right baseline capabilities are, that's good. On the flip side, the more injects you have, the harder it is to get to production, and you entail some risk there. So in some regards, you know, the lead service or lead country with a follow is best in some of those cases, and I think that, but we need to continue dialogue.
Spoken like the next director of Army Aviation. Okay, over there, please.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. Jeff Gonzalez with Jeppesen Boeing. Question is with the desire to have a shared compatibility and collaboration amongst forces, how do you communicate that message to your requirements and programs offices to say, hey, we have this desire to have some kind of compatibility with technology and have that research and development follow in line with that type of strategy?
Who wants to take that one on? Alastair? Yeah.
Thank you. So certainly from our point of view, there's an interesting conundrum in there, and I think it probably talks in aircraft design terms to open systems architecture and comms and data links, etc. And the truth of the matter is you do have to be compatible. There's no point in flying in the same piece of airspace or in adjacent ops boxes. That simply won't work for the type of operations we're talking about. So they do have to be interoperable. I suppose you've got that natural tension between whether you design to requirements and you commission a body to design a piece of equipment from the ground up, and it's multinational, or whether you buy off the shelf and everyone buys the same item off the same shelf and are therefore compatible. And I think that's a natural tension that we see through a lot of acquisition processes. We have, certainly in the UK, we participate in the NATO helicopter requirements group to try to understand and corral what those might be, and it's in the very early stages, so it's in a concept stage at the moment. And that's really about trying to pull together European NATO partners to try and understand what are the baseline requirements. And it really talks to John's point, I think, about some of the NATO nations have probably one single focus. And I suppose if you lived in Eastern Europe, you're going to have one natural focus. Some of the other NATO nations have a multiplicity of tasks, not just high-end warfighting, but we, certainly in the UK, would expect to deploy across the year, across the world, to do various other interventions as well. So I think the requirement set differs, and it's the overlap, and the game is to try and understand the overlap. Some will have a single set of requirements and some will be multiple. But I think for me the basic tension is, do you try to commission something that everybody wants to design, multiple inputs? We know from history that takes time to do, it can be quite expensive. Or do you all agree to buy and acquire the same equipment, which might be a quicker route to market, may or may not be more cost effective. And if you're an industry partner in the room, that's probably quite tantalizing because you want to put your program first. But that seems to be the basic tension I would offer that sits behind that question.
Oh, that was a great comment. So we have about 10 minutes left, and are there any questions on those subjects? Okay, what I'd like to do is go back to something that General McCurry started off with, which is I'm a huge believer in leadership, and he was talking about leadership that trusts each other, has been trained, educated. Let's start off with educated, then trained together, and then operated together. And how do you achieve that in a new environment where we've got this multi-domain portion where it's everything from cyber and space to air and sea and land operations, and it just strikes me as so much more complicated than in my day when we were starting there again on the Fulda Gap. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask for a poll of hands because we have some younger folks out here and some a little bit more senior folks. When I was looking at their resumes, there's a fair amount of exchange going on. Either several officers of our allies coming to U.S. schools, or vice versa, and going. I know in my day, I wanted to go down to Australia to the Command and Staff College, John, but unfortunately I went to Leavenworth. But I sure tried. And I did go to French Commando School, General Bouillaud. I mean, my platoon sergeant wasn't very happy when I took us, but he was an Alabama boy, wasn't used to the snow up in that area. But the whole point of it is it's now so much more complicated. I was going to look out in the audience among our military. Anybody, has any of you been an exchange officer one way or the other? If so, raise your hand. Okay. Is there a microphone out there? I want to pick on you. Can you, so for our French ally right here, the microphone, can you tell us what you did as an exchange officer? And tell us, be honest, was it good, bad? It's on.
Yes, I'm the Major Group so Aviation Gazelle pilot. And since last July, I'm the French liaison officer in USA's Fort Rucker.
Oh, that's awesome. Okay, so General Gaylor's not here. You can tell us how you, what's it like?
Yes, but I have my French boss here and
Very, very good. How about passing the mic back to one of our Australian friends back here, one of the two, and would you give us your experience?
Yes, g'day, sir. Lieutenant Colonel Hayden Archibald. I was exchange officer at 217 Cavalry in working for you, sir, at the 101st.
Yeah.
The exchange was defining for my career in many ways, not just the fact that we got to come across the United States and fly armed aircraft and be exposed to a level of tactics, techniques and procedures, but then also take, with that unit, be fully embedded into an operational theatre for 12 months, which again provided me an enormous amount of operational experience to take back home to the Australian Army. But I'd certainly go back to the first point from General McCurry. The relationship building at that point in my career was fundamental. Being back here now, 12 years later, I can move through the US Army and now know, see, and have break down the glass walls between the relationships of many, not just the US, but across the Allied nations. It's a fundamental experience, sir.
That's. Any other comments? We had a number of hands out here. In fact, it was actually very pleasing. Anybody else that we want to that I'd like to highlight, or somebody else would like to highlight their experience? Okay, so it's back then to the panel. How do we? Yeah, go ahead, John.
I'm sorry, sir. Could I just make one more comment on that, please? We're great benefactors. Colonel Brown there didn't put his hand up, but he was an IP at Fort Rucker for a number of years. Australians have managed to find a way to get on exchanges and do things around the world. I would say that the US Army is not doing this wrong. You are very accepting and forward-leaning in your part of that engagement. So I don't think the US Army has that wrong. And I'll use another example. Last year I was the Deputy Commanding General of the CJFLIC in Iraq under the leadership of General Pyatt and the 10th Mountain Division, and I could not have been accepted any better into that environment than the way I was. It was both collegiate and friendly, and the amount of trust that I was given from day one speaks volumes for I think for our allied relationship, but the US Army is getting this right.
Well, you know, now I'd like to broaden that, John. I'd like you to talk about your experiences there in NATO Command Northeast. I mean, and so we talked a little bit about you educating together and learning to operate together, and that's at an individual basis, which is the precursor then to being to operate as a unit, in my opinion, you know. But I'd like your feelings coming out of a multinational corps. How did you see it, John?
So I'll touch on 2 points. I'll get back to John's comment about us getting it right in a second. First one, though, is I do see a definite evolution in NATO's approach to doing exercises. 5-10 years ago, most NATO forces went into a building, they did their exercise, slapped each other on the back and, blew off sustainment, blew off medevac, and blew off all the hard things, and then said, hey, we won. And, high five and go hit the bar. What I've seen, closer here, just two examples. Sabre Strike, the big exercise, had 19,000 soldiers. They had the 82nd drop in 3 different countries. We had American forces. We had every bit of Europe involved in making sure Sabre Strike went well. And we learned a lot about ourselves and about the NATO force and what we could actually execute and not execute, frankly, on the battlefield. And then just recently, the Poles did Anaconda, and Anaconda is their largest operation. Once again, about 22,000 soldiers involved in doing multiple, not just exercise, but tying an exercise into live fires on the ground and keeping their command and control assets out in order to actually do that. Behind all of that, you find yourself getting better and building relationships and knowing who's out there. And those kind of exercises, and I believe, this is not new stuff, but the United States Army is going to start, doing a Reforger-like operation over in Europe here very soon. And that's going to cause everybody to start thinking about what can we do to be a part of this? What assets do we bring? How do we help each other get after this? Because that adversary on the other side, he's pretty big. And he has some serious capabilities that if we don't come together and figure it out, he's probably going to defeat us. John mentioned we're getting it right. We do have it right in some aspects, but I'll be quite honest, I saw us do some things wrong in NATO too. We're the big guys in the pen. There's no doubt about it. We have a pretty small aviation force. Not as small as Australia, but it's kind of, no, just kidding. But the bottom line is we are the big guys in the house. So what we found, in some of these exercises is that an American force would come in and automatically force everybody else to use a system that they're not familiar with. I'll use logistics as an example. All NATO uses a certain logistical system. The United States uses a different one. Once we convinced 21st Sustainment in Europe to just put all of their data into the NATO system, bam, just like that, everybody knew where all the movements were going, all the trains, which ports were being used, how many people were moving, et cetera, et cetera. So, I challenge our own country sometimes, our own army, to understand that sometimes if we just make a small adjustment to our way of doing things, our TTPs, our SOPs, we automatically build interoperability without causing a lot of problems.
Disruption.
A lot of disruption. Mike?
Yeah, so I agree that sometimes you need tools. You need to come up with technical tools to force interoperability, but I think to the original question, the relationships. So in the Republic of Korea, 2ID, if you notice my patch, it's slightly different from the historic 2ID patch. It's got this combined division tab over the top of it. So in 2015, we brought ROC Army officers onto the staff of the 2nd Infantry Division, and today we have 87 ROC Army officers and NCOs serving in the division, brigade, and battalion staffs within the division. And that's made huge leaps and bounds for both sides, for their visibility into us and how fast we're going to move, and for our ability to understand their country, the terrain in their country, which they know, and the language and all those things. So huge advantage for us with the combined division permanently stationed in Korea.
That's a great point. I mean, yeah. Okay, we have about a minute and a half left, about 2 minutes. Any other burning questions out there for our distinguished panel here before we go ahead and call it quits? Yeah, so and as you're thinking about this, I mean, this is not something that gets handled in the space of a 1 hour panel or anything like that, but it's going to be the challenge for a lot of you in uniform out there among the U.S. and our allies. Is there's no doubt in my mind that we're going to have to figure out how to really increase our capability to operate together on a very complex, large-scale, long-distance, multi-domain operations type of a battlefield. It's actually necessary for deterrence. much less if we have to fight in a battlefield. It's going to be up to a lot of you, your younger folks out there, at the lieutenant colonel level and above, to actually figure this out. But we're looking forward to working. I know, speaking for the U.S. Army Aviation Association of America, we look forward to helping you all use this as a forum to be able to discuss this. We, by the way, many of you may not know that we do host or help host the NATO helicopter working group that comes out every year and has a pretty significant exchange for about a 3-day period. And we look forward to continuing to do those kinds of things among all of our allies. With that, I'd like to thank the panel. Thank you so very much for everything that you've all done. Several of you are old timers for doing this, and I sincerely appreciate it. How about a round of applause to